Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And yours was the first voice I heard talking about the invasion of Venezuela Saturday morning in our coverage anchored by Ali Velshi. And it was really all I wanted to hear. As soon as you finished, I just turned it off and said, okay, I've got enough. That's going to get me through the next several hours rather than obsessively sit there and wait for every little moment to unfold. It's so much easier to deal with the mass of that material after they've delivered it all. But Rachel, tonight I'm sitting here looking at the list of things that I won't be talking about because Donald Trump wants me to talk about Venezuela, obviously. And for once, I am going to talk about what Donald Trump wants me to talk about, but that's no promise for tomorrow night. But it's things like the January 6th anniversary tomorrow. We were going to be covering that tonight. I'm sure Hakeem Jeffries will have something to say about it when he joins us, but it's not getting the attention it should be getting. The Epstein files, and the Epstein files, along with the Obamacare premiums skyrocketing now, this week, right now, it's really happening. The Jack Smith testimony to the House of Representatives, the transcript, the video. We're going to show some of that this hour with Andrew Weissman. But there's so much on this sheet that Donald Trump does not want us to talk about, which he has successfully muted our discussion of tonight by invading Venezuela. And, you know, as timing goes for a guy who's trying to avoid certain subjects, he certainly got to avoid a lot by this particular timing.
Yes, although none of those stories that you talked about are going anywhere. And even if you have to, I mean, we all know what it's like to do news business work at times like this, right? Like, yes, you have to keep a lot of balls in the air, and that's fine. But if you have to, you know, delay something and talk about it on a day you weren't necessarily going to be talking about it, like I've got all of this stuff that I've got. You know, I talked about a lot of those things on the show this hour, but I've got all of this stuff that I would have otherwise gotten to for the rest of this hour that I will absolutely get to both over the course of next week's show and also probably on YouTube between now and then.
Yeah, and same here. I mean, I was texting in and sending in things to the staff and the team this weekend that had nothing to do with Venezuela, things I'd noticed and picked up that I definitely want to get to, and we are going to get to those things. But this stunning situation in Venezuela is upon us, and it is worthy of our attention. That I'll give Donald Trump credit for that. What he has done absolutely does deserve our attention, legal attention, which Andrew Weissman will give it, and also Hakeem Jeffries' attention as to what it means. He was in the briefing today. He actually heard from Marco Rubio privately about what it was all about. So Rachel, we're going to find out what it was all about in a few minutes when Hakeem Jeffries joins us. You know,
the kind of attention that you are going to pay it tonight with Hakeem Jeffries is the kind of attention that I want to be paid to it. So I'm eager to hear it, Lawrence.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks. Well, for tonight's thought experiment, let's begin with consideration of the question of where would Nicolas Maduro be tonight if he was a drug trafficking, murdering, torturing dictator who hated Cuba and never supplied oil to Cuba. Marco Rubio wants you to believe that it's about this. It's all about this. Marco Rubio says that this 25-page indictment is the reason the United States of America invaded Venezuela and captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Most of the pages of the 25-page indictment do not attempt to describe crimes committed by Maduro or his wife. The indictment alleges that Maduro and his wife participated in a drug trafficking conspiracy. The only specifics offered about any criminal action involving Nicolas Maduro or his wife refer only to one meeting that his wife attended in 2007, 6 years before she married Maduro and long before Maduro became president of Venezuela. And according to the indictment, in that meeting, Maduro's future wife, quote, accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes to broker a meeting between a large-scale drug trafficker and the director of Venezuela's National Anti-Drug Office. That's it. No specifics about that. No indication of how they know that. And no meetings actually involving Nicolas Maduro are described in the indictment. This is as vague an indictment as you could imagine. But this is why Marco Rubio and Donald Trump launched their one-day war with Venezuela, according to Marco Rubio. The drug trafficking conspiracy described on page 9 of this indictment says the transshipment points in Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico similarly relied on a culture of corruption in which cocaine traffickers operating in those countries paid a portion of their own profits to politicians who protected them and aided them. And last month, Donald Trump pardoned one of the politicians described in that sentence on page 9 of this new indictment, the former president of Honduras. A politician referred to in this Trump Justice Department indictment was pardoned by Donald Trump last month, pardoned for drug trafficking scheme that is mentioned in the new indictment. Donald Trump already pardoned the Honduras guy. Donald Trump said this weekend that he pardoned the convicted drug trafficking president of Honduras because that former president of Honduras was prosecuted while Joe Biden was president of the United States. So any indictments of any drug traffickers during the Biden years are illegitimate, according to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's Justice Department rewrote that indictment, wrote a new indictment for Marco Rubio to stand behind, claiming that he did not wage war on Venezuela. He was simply using the military to enforce an arrest warrant for the Department of Justice. We'll have a more detailed discussion of the Maduro indictment later in this hour when Andrew Weissman joins us. Since Donald Trump's last consideration of a Latin American president accused of and convicted of drug trafficking was to pardon him, there is absolutely no reason to believe that the indictment is why the United States invaded Venezuela. What Marco Rubio did in Venezuela after spending most of the last year, we now know, secretly masterminding the invasion of Venezuela and the capture of Nicolas Maduro, was the closest Marco Rubio could come right now to delivering on the dream that will never die. It is the dream of some Cuban Americans like Marco Rubio and other right-wing extremists in the United States, the dream many of them have held since April of 1961, when a similarly planned invasion of Cuba failed at the Bay of Pigs. 87 days into John F. Kennedy's presidency, the CIA executed a long-planned invasion of Cuba, a plan that began before the Kennedy presidency. The invasion was at the Bay of Pigs, and it was defeated by Fidel Castro, who personally commanded the Cuban Defense Forces at the point of battle. It was a full humiliation for the CIA and the American military, and for President Kennedy, who considered it the worst mistake of his presidency, which it most certainly was. It was a stain on American foreign policy that Americans forgot, but the world did not, especially Latin America. This is the way it was supposed to go. The Bay of Pigs was supposed to go the way Marco Rubio and the team executed the plan in Venezuela. Donald Trump can be presumed to be lying about every reason he gives for everything he does, having been documented by the Washington Post for pathologically telling over 30,000 lies during his first term as president. Everyone who can think has known from the start that Donald Trump's missile attacks on small boats with outboard motors off the coast of Venezuela were not about stopping drug trafficking. None of those boats could have reached the United States. They are all too small and don't carry enough fuel and could only reach the closest island, where they could have easily been intercepted. And now many observers feel vindicated in the belief that it was never about the drugs in those missile strikes, because Donald Trump has now said it's about the oil. But what if he's lying again? What if it is not about the oil? What if it is about Marco Rubio's dream? What if it's about Cuba?
Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation. And we want to help the people of it's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba, but we want to also help the people that were forced out of Cuba and living in this country. Do you want to say something about that, Marco, please?
Well, I mean, I just gave you a statement a few minutes ago about, when the president speaks, you should take him seriously. So, suffice it to say, Cuba is a disaster. It's run by incompetent, senile men, and in some cases, not senile, but incompetent nonetheless. It has no economy. It's in total collapse. And by the way, they were, all of the guards that helped protect Maduro, this is well known, their whole spy agency, all that were full of Cubans. I mean, it's amazing. This poor island took over Venezuela in some cases. One of the biggest problems the Venezuelans have is they have to declare independence from Cuba. They tried to basically colonize it from a security standpoint. So, yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned, at least a little bit.
A little bit. Marco Rubio doesn't really care about Venezuela. Marco Rubio cares that Venezuela has provided oil for Cuba. Marco Rubio wants to starve Cuba of oil and all other resources. That has been the failed purpose of the American embargo on Cuba for our entire lifetimes. Donald Trump may understand none of this, or he might understand a little bit of it. But it doesn't seem impossible for Marco Rubio to convince Donald Trump of the glorious place in history for him if he becomes the American president who finally liberates Cuba from dictatorship, finally fulfills the dream that will never die. If starving Cuba of resources does not work, we have now seen the dress rehearsal for an invasion of Cuba aimed at regime change. If that happens, when a reporter asks who will be running Cuba, there would be no disagreement between Donald Trump and Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio would proudly announce that he is running Cuba if he gets that chance. If Cuba is the real target, it serves Donald Trump's fog of confusion style to throw in threats to Colombia and Greenland and any other place he can think of while he's at it. There will never be a move of any kind against Greenland. Greenland is nothing but a Trump device for distraction, and it works. You will be able to find television discussions of, will they send troops to Greenland? Every second of that is nonsense, and every second of that is a successful Trumpian distraction from what they are really doing. President Kennedy was in the grip of very bad advice when he agreed to launch the Bay of Pigs invasion, an invasion that had been planned. The beginning of the planning occurred under President Eisenhower, the Republican president who preceded President Kennedy. American presidential politics has been in the grip of the Cuban-American dream of overthrowing dictatorship in Cuba ever since. And because Cuban Americans are concentrated in the important electoral college state of Florida, the United States of America has been politically, in effect, prevented through the mathematics of presidential politics from normalizing relations with the harmless little country 90 miles from Florida. Republicans in particular have spent the last 65 years lying about how threatening to the United States and the world the tiny country of Cuba is. And now Donald Trump and Marco Rubio have shown how easy it is to lie to a very supportive Republican Party and presumably Republican voters about what a threat to the national security of the United States Venezuela is. No one had ever heard that before, but they have succeeded on their side of our politics with that lie. Donald Trump believes the American military is his plaything, but the law and the Constitution says otherwise. The power to initiate war lies exclusively with Congress, and the power to initiate emergency military action for national defense rests with the president, but since 1973 requires the president to follow a formal notification process with Congress. That is the law. That law was violated by Marco Rubio willfully, and Donald Trump willfully in their invasion of Venezuela. But today, Marco Rubio explained it all to our first guest tonight. Leading off our discussion tonight is House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Leader. Really appreciate it. You were one who got to be in the briefing today to find out what this is really all about. What did you learn from Marco Rubio and the other members of the cabinet who were in that briefing?
Well, I think many of us on the Democratic side certainly left with more questions than answers. We pressed Secretary Rubio and others about the plan moving forward and what exactly Donald Trump meant when he said that we, meaning the Trump administration, presumably, were running Venezuela. When what's clear is that Donald Trump and the administration can't even run the United States of America and keep the promises that they made to the American people, including promising to lower the high cost of living on day one, when we know that's been a disaster. Costs aren't going down, they're going up. Life is more expensive under Donald Trump and his policies and his Trump tariffs. Now, the American people, we made clear, are not interested in seeing American boots on the ground, our men and women in uniform, put in harm's way as part of whatever scheme Donald Trump and his administration are executing relative to Venezuela or any other place. And so one of the things that we're going to have to do, Lawrence, here in the Congress is to act immediately to make clear that no further military action can take place without explicit congressional approval.
So Marco Rubio has said publicly that he thought this is the kind of operation where you just can't follow the rules. You just can't give any prior notice, no matter how secretly, to anyone in Congress.
We pressed them on that. And in fact, the administration, though they've said that their concern is that if they communicate anything to Congress, even a subset of congressional leaders, the problem is that information is going to leak. But I explicitly asked them to give us a single example of them communicating with members of the Gang of Eight or other high-level members of congressional leadership, and that information then becoming public. And the response was crickets. Lawrence, they had no answer because there's no example of it. And we're going to continue to make the case, of course, that the Constitution is not a mere inconvenience in the United States of America. It needs to be followed. And Congress explicitly was given the sole authority to declare war and therefore to authorize acts of military aggression that have all of the indicia of an act of war.
What did you hear from Marco Rubio or anyone else from the administration in that briefing that they have not said publicly?
Well, you know, we're not at liberty, of course, to reveal many of the details that were discussed because it was a highly classified briefing. But suffice is to say that many of us, I don't think, were persuaded that the justification that has been articulated publicly by the administration, that this was a law enforcement operation that had anything to do, you know, with keeping the American people safe. We weren't persuaded by, you know, that argument because they can't explain in clear terms how this helps the national security of the American people in any way, shape, or form. You broke down the indictment. I know others are going to talk about it. This is the same administration that, of course, just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who's one of the largest narco traffickers in the world, who was sentenced after being found guilty of narco trafficking of epic proportions, flooding the country with more than 400 tons of cocaine, then sentenced to 45 years of hard time in a federal prison. Donald Trump pardons him just a few weeks ago, and they now want the country to believe that this unprecedented military action in Venezuela is about narco trafficking. Of course it's not. It does appear to be about oil. And I can tell you that there was a lot of conversation, we've heard this publicly as well, about oil and American access to that oil and being able to control it, but still nothing that was discussed as it relates to how the life of everyday Americans is going to be made any better.
What did you come out of it with an understanding of what the administration's next step is in Venezuela?
Well, we pressed the administration on this very point, and there's a lack of clarity as it relates to the situation. Of course, the Chavez regime remains in place, and in many ways, and the Maduro folks who've taken over the last several years, they remain in place, including the vice president, who's now apparently at least the titular head of the regime at this moment. And how that makes life better for the Venezuelan people is unclear. The one thing that we'll continue to point out is that the future of Venezuela should be determined by the people of Venezuela, not by Stephen Miller, God forbid, or any other member of the Trump administration, notwithstanding what Donald Trump is talking about. But there's no real plan that we've heard from the Trump administration as to how to ensure that the Venezuelan people will actually get self-determination, the self-determination that they certainly deserve.
Was there any form of confusion, between, say, the defense secretary, the secretary of state, CIA director, people in the room? Was there an indication that they as a group didn't know what was happening next?
Well, most of the jurisdiction in terms of what comes next does fall within the portfolio of the Secretary of State. And so when we pressed him repeatedly on what comes next, there was just a lack of clarity because, of course, there's a great deal of uncertainty. There's chaos that could be unleashed in Venezuela. There are competing forces who are battling for power in the vacuum that was left as a result of, Maduro now being apprehended. And look, Maduro's a bad guy, and he oppressed the Venezuelan people. He was not legitimately elected. That election in 2024, we know, was stolen. But when it comes to actually having a plan to put the people of Venezuela in the best possible position moving forward, it doesn't exist. And that's problematic. And that's why when you take these type of military actions, but you're not thinking through what comes next, we've seen this turn into a disaster. That certainly was the case in Iraq. And the American people don't want to see that type of foreign policy disaster happen ever again.
Donald Trump has succeeded in pushing aside stories he really doesn't want covered, at least temporarily. Epstein files, Jack Smith's testimony, and January 6th anniversary tomorrow, less than a year after Donald Trump pardoned everyone who attacked you at the Capitol that day.
That's exactly right. And the irony is that Donald Trump promises to lower costs on day one, but instead, on day one of his presidency, he pardons hundreds of violent felons who brutally assaulted the Capitol, beat police officers, seriously injured more than 140 brave law enforcement men and women. Some subsequently lost their lives. Many were injured in ways both physically and psychologically in terms of damage that is now permanent. And yet Donald Trump pardons these individuals and then unleashes them to go back to communities all across the country where many of them have committed violent crimes and have reoffended. And we've got to make sure that that story is told. And we also have to make sure that there's value to free and fair elections in the United States of America. There's value to the peaceful transfer of power. There's value to ensuring that the rule of law remains central to who we are as a country. All of those things were threatened, of course, by what took place 5 years ago on January 6th, which is why it's important that we never forget and that we learn the lessons of January 6th so that we never allow it to happen again.
Leader Jeffries, I hope you can join us on this program on this exact date a year from now, because you may be Speaker of the House by that time, 1 year from now, just 1 year from now. As we sit here in January, drowning in Trumpian abuse of power and this swirl of stories, what do you think will be the issue in the first week of November when voters are deciding who will run the House of Representatives next year?
Well, I think central to what the American people decide is going to be who's actually committed to making their life better. And that's our fight as Democrats. We want to lower the high cost of living. We want to make life more affordable. We want to fix our broken healthcare system. And of course, we want to clean up corruption so we can deliver a country that actually works for working class Americans. And I think the failure of the Trump administration has been they're focused on so many other things, most recently what took place in Venezuela, but not focused on improving the quality of life of everyday Americans, because they rather spend their time trying to engage in this scheme or that scheme to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless and reward their billionaire donors, which is exactly what they did in their one big ugly bill, while cutting Medicaid by the largest amount in American history and ripping healthcare away from more than 14 million Americans. The whole thing has been a failure. The American people are rejecting Republican extremism, and they're embracing the Democratic vision for making their life better and dealing with the affordability crisis that exists here in our great country.
House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you in advance for joining us 1 year from tonight and many times in between. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And coming up, Donald Trump has proven once again that it was all a lie when it comes to Republicans and regime change. They're for it once again. Senator Adam Schiff will join us next. The United States needs to stay out of Venezuela. Let the Venezuelan people determine their future. That is what Donald Trump's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said before she became Donald Trump's Director of National Intelligence. Republicans who supported regime change, invasions, and wars run by Republican presidents suddenly decided that they agreed with Donald Trump, that the Republican history of regime change, wars, and invasions was the worst thing ever supported by the Republican Party. But now that Donald Trump has launched a regime change invasion, Republicans are once again the party of regime change invasions, which brings to mind the title of Stuart Stevens' insightful book about the Republican Party after it was taken over by Donald Trump. Stuart Stevens, who had worked on winning and losing Republican presidential campaigns, titled his book about the Trump era of the Republican Party, "It Was All a Lie." Joining us now is Democratic Senator Adam Schiff of California. He is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Schiff, Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Durbin of the Senate Judiciary Committee are also now demanding a briefing about what happened in Venezuela, since Marco Rubio is claiming they just did it for the Justice Department. It was just to execute that warrant for the Justice Department.
Yes, Rubio was just adding one lie to another. For months and months, as they engaged in these boat strikes, they claimed this was about narcotics. It was not about regime change. They just wanted to stop these drug boats from coming to the United States, even though they weren't bound for our shores. Tim Kaine, myself, Rand Paul offered war powers resolutions to bring an end to this. They had bipartisan support, but not enough to pass. But nevertheless, the administration persisted. This is about drugs. Even after Donald Trump pardoned a former drug-running president of Honduras, they insisted this is about drugs, not regime change. Now they've gone in, used the military, grabbed Maduro, this heinous leader of Venezuela, and his wife. And if this were about drugs and not regime change, you would think that was the end of it. But no, They say they're going to run the country now, that we're going to run Venezuela. And the reason they have been oddly transparent about for the first time, it's about oil. It's about oil. It's about the oil wealth of Venezuela, which has reportedly some of, if not the largest oil reserves in the world. What we seem to see is Donald Trump's campaign promise to the oil industry that if they spend hundreds of millions or $1 billion on his campaign, he would richly reward them. We are now seeing that reward. But in terms of that MAGA base that you were talking about, Lawrence, that he promised no more foreign wars, no more nation building, this is a big militaristic middle finger to the MAGA base by Donald Trump. We are now very much back in regime change business, and we are just being overt about it. We will use our military. We will depose foreign leaders if we can have access to their mineral wealth.
Yeah, Republicans like Lindsey Graham, who spent all of the Bush years in the 21st century completely supporting every invasion, every regime change move. Suddenly, when Donald Trump enters their politics, they forget that they supported all of that, all of them. And Republican voters apparently forgot that they supported it in the election and re-election of George W. Bush. And now here they are, full circle, back where they started this century, in full support of regime change invasions.
Well, that's right. There is one difference, though, at least arguably. At the time, for example, of Iraq, George W. Bush made a different kind of argument. He made an argument about trying to bring democracy to the region. If you'll remember, that was part of one of his inaugural addresses. There was at least a nod to democracy. Here, there's not even a nod to democracy. If there is, it's disdainful shrug when he was asked about the now Nobel Prize winning opposition leader. He denigrated her, saying, well, she doesn't really have the support. She doesn't have the wherewithal. She has a lot more support than Donald Trump. She has 72% approval in Venezuela, double Donald Trump's approval on the economy here in the United States. But he doesn't even make the pretense of that. He is just overt about it. This is about oil. If it was, as Marco Rubio put it, as you pointed out, this is all about bringing Maduro to justice in the U.S. courts. It's a law enforcement operation, nothing more. Then what explains Trump saying we're going to run the country? If this was merely an apprehension of a fugitive, that wouldn't require us to run the country. But we are going to apparently be running the country through the number 2 of this corrupt Maduro regime, the former vice president, now, I guess, acting president. So we've only changed the top of the regime, but we are going to work with that corrupt drug-running regime if it will give us access to oil.
Senator Adam Schiff, thank you very much for joining our coverage tonight.
Thanks, Lawrence.
And coming up, we'll get Andrew Weissman's reading of the indictment of Nicolas Maduro next. This is not a Jack Smith indictment. It does not provide the specific incriminating evidence that appeared to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Jack Smith's indictments of Donald Trump included. The Trump Justice Department indictment of Nicolas Maduro has no text messages to quote or emails to quote or taped conversations to quote incriminating Nicolas Maduro. On New Year's Eve, Republicans in the House of Representatives released the 8-hour transcript and video of Jack Smith's testimony to the House Judiciary Committee, in which he fully defended his indictments of Donald Trump and his belief that Donald Trump was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in both cases. But tonight, the Trump Justice Department indictment of Nicolas Maduro has overshadowed Jack Smith's skilled defense of the Trump indictments. The Trump Justice Department indictment of Nicolas Maduro, his wife, and 4 other defendants who were not apprehended, accuses them all of drug trafficking without any specificity and cocaine importation without any specificity, and in a burst of Republican hypocrisy, the possession of firearms from 1999 until 2025. 27 years of possession of firearms in Venezuela can now get you indicted in New York. Joining us now is Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel and an MS Now legal analyst. Andrew, your reading of this indictment.
Well, One thing I would note that gives me some reason to think that this is not just a trumped up charge, the kind of thing that we have seen with respect to Letitia James and James Comey, is that while this is styled as a new indictment and it was just issued, there was a similar indictment, at least of Maduro, in 2020, which looks like the halcyon days of the first Trump administration, but at least a time when prosecutors were not doing what they're doing now in the Letitia James and James Comey cases. And so it does very much mirror the prior case. And so that gives me some reason to think, it coming from the Southern District of New York, that there are facts to support what is there. There also is reason to believe that there are cooperating witnesses, that people in that prior case are now cooperating with the U.S. government. Those can be very tricky and difficult witnesses, but at least that is more reason to think that they will at least have a sort of a true good faith argument to go forward. And finally, with respect to the weapons charge, one thing to note, because I've been asked a lot about sort of why those charges, is those weapon charges carry with them a particularly stinging result, a jail sentence if there is a conviction, which is a 30-year mandatory sentence. And so it puts a real sort of gun to the head of the defendant in terms of saying, you really risk a lot by going to trial and not pleading guilty and working out some kind of deal, given that the judge does not have a lot of discretion if you're convicted of that count.
Andrew, want to squeeze in a commercial break? Please stay with us. We're going to cover the thing that Donald Trump doesn't want us to cover tonight, Jack Smith's testimony to the House Judiciary Committee defending his indictments of Donald Trump. We'll do that after this break. We'll be right back with Andrew Weissmann. Jack Smith finally spoke, and Republicans don't want you to hear it, which is why they released his recorded testimony to the House Judiciary Committee on New Year's Eve, 2 weeks after it occurred. In 8 hours of testimony, Jack Smith defended his indictments of Donald Trump and said in both cases that he had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump was guilty. Here's some of what Jack Smith said about Donald Trump's conspiracy to overturn the presidential election, culminating in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th.
The evidence here made clear that President Trump was, by a large measure, the most culpable and most responsible person in this conspiracy. These crimes were committed for his benefit. The attack that happened at the Capitol as part of this case does not happen without him. The other co-conspirators were doing this for his benefit. Our view of the evidence was that he caused it and that he exploited it, and that it was foreseeable to him. Once the attack on the Capitol happened, he refused to stop it. He instead issued a tweet that, without question in my mind, endangered the life of his own vice president. When the violence was going on, he had to be pushed repeatedly by his staff members to do anything to quell it.
Andrew Weissmann is back with us. Andrew, 8 hours of testimony. There was an awful lot that Jack Smith had to cover, and he covered it without any significant challenge from Republicans.
And I would recommend people to listen to it. If you can't listen to all of it, at least listen to the first hour. He describes that he really has the goods. He describes the evidence and how he was going to make the case if he was allowed to get to trial. And it's particularly poignant on this day, on the eve of the 5th anniversary of January 6th, to take note of all of that evidence and of what Jack has to say about it. It very much ties in with where we are in Venezuela. This was 5 years ago, an attempt to undermine the sovereignty of our country that is something that we are seeing happen with respect to the sovereignty of Venezuela and is being threatened with respect to several other countries, like dominoes. And so I highly, highly recommend listening to Jack Smith and getting a measure of the man in that video.
Yeah, it's really, other than the clips we saw of your interview with Jack Smith in London some couple of months ago, I think, that's the only time we've got to hear his voice on any of this. Let's listen to what he had to say about the classified documents case.
Our investigation also developed powerful evidence that showed that President Trump willfully retained highly classified documents after he left office in January of 2021, storing them at his social club, including in a ballroom and a bathroom. He then repeatedly tried to obstruct justice to conceal his continued retention of those documents.
Did you believe that you had sufficient evidence to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yes.
And Andrew, as we sit here tonight, we can only imagine what classified documents Donald Trump will be illegally taking with him when he leaves office this time.
It's worth noting that Jack could not speak freely about that case in the sort of the whole second part of his report, because Judge Cannon, who has that case, even though the case is over, had issued a court order that is still in effect, saying that no one can talk about what's in that report. And she has been sort of reprimanded by the 11th Circuit to actually decide a pending motion to have the part of his report released because the case is over. And sure enough, she's still sitting on it. And that's something the public is entitled to know. It's true. All other special counsel reports and special counsels have testified publicly. The reports have been issued publicly, and she is stopping that and preventing it, as is her practice of doing things that side with Donald Trump.
Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for joining our coverage tonight.
You're welcome.
We'll be right back. Andrew Weissmann gets tonight's last word.